Yeah, the Frankfurt Memory Studies platform really tries to be a platform in the sense that it wants to bring scholars of different disciplines and also of different national backgrounds together in the study of memory. And we advocate a very broad understanding of the term memory. Memory is what we individually remember, and we would claim that's always socially, culturally shaped. But memory is also what you find in the big commemorative events, for example, commemorating the Holocaust, soon to be commemorating the Corona pandemic. So there is a whole spectrum where memory plays a role. Memory, broadly defined, would be interrelations of past, present, and future as they happen in sociocultural contexts. And if you have such a broad definition, you need people on board all the way from psychology to philosophy, to history, to the social sciences. And as we are located, we basically come from literary studies and the philologies, but our institutes that are strongly involved in memory studies do something like global studies or post-colonial studies. And that means we immediately have a broad comparative vision, mainly in the Anglophone world, and then also in the Roman-speaking worlds of memory. Yeah, to use an example, what I am personally very interested in right now is how the coronavirus pandemic is a global challenge or a test case for collective memory. Because you can see when you compare how the pandemic was experienced, dealt with in places as diverse as the Philippines, Europe, or the Americas, you see how certain collective memories preform the way you deal with a pandemic. Put very simply, the Germans or the Western Europeans had no memory of strong pandemics. They also had no memory of the Spanish flu. And this is why it took extremely long in order to grasp what was going on and to do such simple things like wearing face masks. If you compare that with Asia, parts of Asia, in particular East Asia, have a very strong memory of pandemics, which goes back all the way to the Spanish flu. And they, of course, they had more recent, they had the Asian flu, the swine flu, and all these flus played a greater role in the recent past with them. And they knew what to do. You had a greater compliance. People knew what to do, wearing face masks and so on. And this is how collective memory shapes present moments. And of course, as the pandemic has been going on for almost 2 years now, we have also entered the phase where commemorative events are being staged. And that's interesting to compare how different countries does that, how commemoration of the coronavirus happens mainly in national frameworks. So all over Europe, we had major national commemorative events in Germany, in Italy, in the UK. And I'm curious to see whether there are more international events to follow, because the pandemic is, of course, a global, and it might or should be commemorated globally. And as you see from that one example, these questions may range all the way from commemoration studies, political studies, sociology, to questions of art studies, because coronavirus pandemic found expression in artistic media very strongly. For example, comics, as I have realized with the course I taught last semester, have been a major medium of framing the pandemic. And of course, these questions go all the way to social psychology and questions like, why would many Germans not want to have a vaccination? What are their historical memories? What are their frames of reference? So that would be just one recent example. Memory is always, it plays out on different scales. And for a long time in the 1980s and 1990s, the major scale that scholars looked at was the national scale. There's nothing wrong with this, because the national is an important, Maurice Halbwachs would say, framework of memory. Maurice Halbwachs, of course, the sociologist who wrote in the 1920s the foundational books of collective memory studies. So Halbwachs, who never looked at the national level, he looked at the familial, at class levels and so on. He did not look at the national level. But in his words, that's a framework of memory. You could also say it's a scale of memory. That's important because I think in each nation, broadcasting agencies still operate very much nationally. Education operates nationally. The press operates nationally. So these are important players in the making of collective memory. And that's why the national frame is, of course, important. Also linguistically, very important. But then at the same time, there are very important transnational, you could also say transcultural, traveling or multi-directional dynamics of memory. So we don't live in containers that would be sealed, but we always have influences from elsewhere. We compare. We could, for example, ask how are genocides commemorated elsewhere or political injustices? How does the populist right use memory in the Netherlands as compared to Germany, as compared to the UK, for example? So memory travels, it migrates, it flows, and it will have new combinations in different locations. And there are two major, these are not the only ones, but there are two major components or elements or, let's say, agents in this flow of memory, and that's migration and global media. So with migrants in the largest sense, widest sense, that could be travelers, soldiers, refugees, diasporas, repertoires of cultural memories move elsewhere. And they are spoken about, and they, we would say, transculturalize or hybridize with certain local memories. That's one important thing. And the other thing is global media culture. So we can see when we speak to people in Asia, for example, how shaped they are by US media culture, by Hollywood, for example. These popular media often give us the schemata with which we think, experience, and remember. Germans, up until very recently, did not see themselves as a colonizing country. And the post-colonial Germany or post-colonizing Germany would have been an oxymoron for them, really a strange combination of terms. You could say that German collective memory, if you project it from the present backwards to the past, ended in the 1920s, when Hitler and the National Socialists slowly began to rise. So the elephant in the room for German collective memory is the Nazi time and the Holocaust. And in a sense, this is something that overshadowed things that were going on earlier. Also histories of perpetration. And this is something that has been slowly coming to the fore. Of course, there are scholars who have been working on German colonial history, for example, in Africa for 3 decades now. But the question, and that's a typical memory question, is when does historical knowledge, which is stored somewhere and which is circulated in expert circles, at what point does it really enter the public debate? And not only enter it, but stays there, because you could also see that the German newspapers across the past 3 decades, sometimes these colonial histories came up, were debated, but then they sunk down again. So what you need in memory culture is really these memories to emerge and to stay on the agenda. And I would say in order to stay on the agenda, you need to be able to include these histories into a coherent, a good narrative. And that was always a bit difficult in Germany, because the narrative with the Nazis, the Holocaust as a negative foundational memory for the new Germany and also for Europe, That's a clear narrative. How to bring in the colonial history of the late 19th century is a more difficult matter. And that's being debated now. Some people say we are a historians' debate or dispute too is raging in Germany now. And there are protagonists like Jürgen Zimmerer, who is very active in this, but there are also protagonists from Australia and the United States, like Dirk Moses and Michael Rothberg, who have entered the debate. And that's something that needs to be debated. So we have, for a scholar, an exciting transformative phase in the history of collective memory in Germany now.